In your everyday life, you are surrounded by living organisms, non-living things. What does make the difference between the two? Are there special atoms, chemicals, found only in living organisms? In this video, you'll discover that inert and living matters are in fact not distinguished by the chemical elements they contain, but by the relative abundance of these elements and the connection they make with each other. What are the major atoms found in living versus inert matter? This periodic table shows a small number of elements labeled in green. These are the major components of living organisms. They are combined to form a large number of biomolecules that vary both in structure and complexity. The elements labeled in yellow are present in trace amounts in living organisms, but still have vital roles that will be discussed in later videos. As you can see on this table, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen make up 95% of the weight of a human body. Carbon by itself represents 50% of desiccated living matter. In contrast, in Earth's crust, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen are present in low or trace amounts. In contrast, oxygen, silicon, aluminum, and iron are the major components of the crust. Why is so much carbon needed in living organisms? Aside from water, the majority of biomolecules are carbon-based. It is efficient for living organisms to use one atom for a lot of purposes. Its extreme versatility makes carbon a unique atom. Carbon can be used to build molecules of different shapes and geometry: linear chains, branched chains, cyclical structure. This structural diversity leads to functional diversity. So let's take a look at a carbon atom. Carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. The number of electrons and their position in atomic orbitals are key to carbon's versatility. Electrons are distributed in space with specific shapes called orbitals. For carbon, the first 2 orbitals, each containing 2 electrons, are spherical and are called 1s and 2s. The 2s orbital is further away from the nucleus than the 1s. Carbon has also 3 equivalent barbell-shaped orbitals called 2px, y, and z. The remaining 2 electrons are unpaired and each occupies one 2p orbital, leaving the third orbital, 2pz, unoccupied. Remember, covalent bonds between 2 atoms are formed when one orbital for each atom, carrying an unpaired electron, fuse into a molecular orbital which will now contain 2 electrons. Based on my description on the carbon atom, with its 2 unpaired electrons, one could predict that a carbon atom can only form 2 covalent bonds with other atoms. But you probably know some molecules where carbon makes 4 bonds. Methane, a byproduct of the metabolism of some bacteria, is one of such molecules where one carbon forms 4 bonds with hydrogen atoms, as you can see on this 3-dimensional structure. I will take this opportunity to describe how we will represent molecules in 3 dimensions. The bonds depicted by straight lines on this figure are in the plane of the screen. The bond, represented by a solid wedge, sticks out of the screen toward you, and the bond, represented by a hashed wedge, sticks backwards behind the screen. How can carbon make 4 covalent bonds? The electron in carbon can shift around, and one electron from the 2s orbital can be promoted to the empty 2pz orbital. Now the 2s and the 3 2p orbitals contain each an unpaired electron. So in theory, now 4 covalent bonds can be formed, but would be unequal since unpaired electrons are not on identical orbitals. Unequal bonds are very unstable. So what's the solution? Promoting one electron is not sufficient. The orbitals must also undergo a process called hybridization. The hybridization of the 4 orbitals equalizes the characteristics of the 4 unpaired electrons. The newly formed sp3 orbitals have 25% s character and 75% p character. On this diagram, we can see the 4 sp3 orbitals of carbon needed to form a molecule of methane. These orbitals spread themselves into space as far from each other as possible. Each fuses with the s orbital of an hydrogen atom, forming 4 identical bonds at 109.5 degrees from one another. The carbon occupies the center of a geometric shape called a tetrahedron, with the 4 hydrogens at the vertices. Now, how can carbon make bonds with 3 and not 4 other atoms? In biomolecules such as ethylene, a plant hormone controlling the ripening of fruits, each carbon bonds 3 atoms, 2 hydrogen and the other carbon. In this case, electrons have to rearrange differently around the carbon atom. In other words, a different type of hybridization occurs. Once again, one electron from the 2s orbital is promoted to a 2p orbital. However, only 3 and not 4 hybrid orbitals are formed. These are called the sp2 orbitals, and they have 33% s character and 67% p character. The sp2 orbitals are arranged in a planar trigonal structure 120 degrees apart from each other. The remaining unpaired electron still occupies the 2p orbital. This 2pz orbital is orthogonal to the plane containing the sp2 orbitals. To make ethylene, 2 trigonal structures come together. 2 sp2 orbitals fuse head-to-head to form a sigma covalent bond between the 2 carbons. The sideways overlap of the 2 2pz orbitals lead to the formation of a new covalent bond called a pi bond between the 2 carbons. Each of the remaining 4 sp2 orbitals fuse with the 1s orbitals of hydrogen atoms to form 4 carbon-hydrogen bonds. In ethylene, the 2 carbons are linked by a double bond, 1 sigma and 1 pi bond. The electrons involved in the pi bond occupy a ring-shaped space between the 2 carbons. Finally, how can carbon bond with 2 other atoms? Once again, 1 electron from the 2s orbital is promoted to the empty 2p orbital. And then 2 of the orbitals carrying unpaired electrons are hybridized. The result are 2 sp orbitals with 50% s character and 50% p character. The sp orbitals are 180 degrees from each other. The other 2 unpaired electrons remain on 2p orbitals, 2py and 2pz. When 2 of these linear structures come together, 2 sp orbitals overlap head-to-head to form a sigma bond between the 2 carbons. Sideways overlaps between pairs of 2p orbitals on each carbon leads to the formation of 2 pi bonds between carbons. Therefore, the 2 carbons are connected by a triple bond. Finally, the other sp orbitals carried by the 2 carbon fuse with the 1s orbitals of hydrogen atoms to form 2 carbon-hydrogen bonds. The molecule formed is acetylene. Acetylene is not produced by living organisms, but can be made synthetically and used to ripen fruits. Acetylene is extremely combustible due to the instability of the triple bonds. This instability might explain why almost no biomolecule contains a triple bond. So now, what are the consequences of the various types of bond found in biomolecules? Different bonds affect the geometry and the reactivity of biomolecules. As you can see on this table, we can consider three characteristics. First, we will consider the differences in bond length. The shape of a molecule is determined by the type of atom's bond. For example, a bond between an oxygen and a hydrogen is shorter than a single bond between two carbons. The shape of the molecule is also determined by the presence of a single versus a double bond. As you can see on the table, the length of a double bond between two carbons is shorter than the length of a single bond between two carbons. The second characteristic to take into account is the strength of the bond. Different bonds have different strengths. For example, the bond strength between carbon linked by a double bond is higher, as you might expect, than that of carbon linked by a single bond, but not twice as high. Therefore, the pi bond is weaker than the sigma bond, and the presence of a double bond increases the reactivity of a molecule because you have now a bond that is weaker and can break easily. The third characteristic is the electronegativity. When two different atoms are engaged in a covalent bond, one atom has a stronger pull on the electrons. This property is called electronegativity. The difference of electronegativity determines the relative position of the electrons in the molecular orbital between two atoms. And that will affect the reactivity of the molecule, in particular its ability to donate and receive electrons in an oxidation-reduction reaction. So in this video, you've learned how carbon can create a wide variety of structure based on the physical and chemical nature of carbon bonds